उल्टा नहीं हो रही है आपको लिखा है माँ सीधा दिखाई दे माँ सीधा दिखाई दे मैंने बोल रहा था मेरा वहाँ से मेरा कैमरा मूवमेंट करेगा ठीक है ना मैंने क्लोजअप भी लेने लेकिन एक ही जगह से थोड़ा सा बोल
Assume and those are finally considered that we have to resolve. हाँ हम तो मीडिया वाले पैनलिस्ट चेत हाँ मीडिया वाले
Hi, Abhi. How are you?
I'll just get you right.
Yes. Thank you.
Come. Would you come? Yes. Yeah. Excuse me.
Okay, may I welcome everybody here and request Parsi to please, should we start with the process? I think you're giving a formal welcome and then launch your website.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. It's great to see you on Saturday morning. As you know, this is the 25th year of India's economic reforms. Right? That happened in 1991. If you think about it, half of India wasn't even born or is born after 1991. They have pretty much no idea about what the life was like before 1991. So what we are going to do today is to launch a crowdsourcing website or a portal called indiabefore91.in, and then have a sort of panel discussion on what the life was like before, what happened during the reform period. As you know, there's a famous book written by C.J. Ramesh covering that time period in India's history. And maybe we talked a bit about what the life has been since reforms. Right? We also would discuss whether reforms were part of the circumstance we were in, or were part of the conviction that we somehow acquired in the 90s about going further towards markets. So that's the sort of general focus of the program. Actually, the idea for this portal came in a dinner conversation with Swaminathan Iyer. I think many of you read probably Swaminathan's column in Times of India. So we were just discussing about the fact that he was going to put together his Swaminathan's columns in a book to celebrate the 25th years of reforms. And we're discussing about what experience the CCS has in the student program that we do. And as you know, we run a public policy course for college students. And we do actually a survey of what their thinking is before they take the course, and then how the thinking has changed or not after the course. So we have very good data in terms of what the people have been thinking and what their thinking is after the course. And I was mentioning to him that hardly anyone remembers, in at least the college group that we do our programs in, what the life was like before 91. And we thought that it would be very important not only to celebrate the fact of reform, but also to make sure that the half of our population knows what India was and what has changed India, what has made India what it is today, in which they currently live. I think that's an interesting part of our history and needs to be very well documented. So the idea behind the portal is to collect stories from people from all walks of life, not just business, and not just economists and politicians, but farmers, housewives, small businesses, street vendors, right? So across the spectrum, what did people feel about the life before 91? And as you can see, by contrast, of course, we will talk about indirectly what changes have happened because of reforms. So that's the general purpose for the website. I think the license Raj term, as you know, came from Rajaji. So Rajaji, who was the founder of Swatantra Party, was the only market-friendly political party that we had in India. In the late 50s that he started. He described the Indian version of sort of socialist pattern of society or central planning, that the model that we had adopted, as Kota Permit License Raj. Right? So that was a phrase that he had coined. And since then, that phrase has been modified in various ways and stayed with us even now. And we refer to that time period of India's history either as the Hindu rate of growth, and which was other term that was coined to describe that part of the history, or as the license Raj, license permit Kota Raj, as Rajaji actually called it. So I think as a liberal, market liberal libertarian, we sort of value three basic freedoms. Right? One is, of course, the political freedom, right to choose our own representatives. Second is personal freedom, freedom of expression, conscience, movement, assembly. Those are the personal freedoms. Fortunately for us, from 1947, 1950, since the Constitution was adopted, we have had those two freedoms guaranteed by the Constitution. India probably was the first democracy of this size which went for universal adult franchise at the time of birth. Most democracies, as you know, did not have universal adult franchise when they began, right, including the United States. It took a long time for them to get to the point of every adult being able to vote, while we started in 1950 with that promise. So only area I think we had a debate, as you see in the Constitutional Assembly, was about economic freedom. And there's a lot of debate that highlighted that we should put in the Constitution that India is a socialist society. The person who opposed that idea quite vehemently and finally actually carried the day was Babasaheb Ambedkar. So he said, economic system is something that should be open to people's needs of the time. We should not bind the hands of the people forever by putting in the Constitution what kind of ecosystem that we are going to have. And then he prevailed in convincing the Assembly that we should not include socialism as the commitment from the Constitution to what kind of ecosystem we are going to have. And you can see why that was very important for Dr. Ambedkar to win that debate. Right? And we have seen the changes that happened, obviously, since that point in time with the center planning and the reform that came after it. Actually, when I recently met with C.J. Ramesh, he welcomed us by saying, "Are you still a libertarian?" Right. And then my response was, "Oh, depends how you define liberty." So I'm just being a little more diplomatic. And he actually, I'm saying this because I referred to libertarian, classical liberal earlier in my discussion. And he defined, which I found is very apt definition of what a market liberal or a libertarian would be. Right? So he defined libertarian being someone who privatizes everything. So privatize, privatize, privatize. And whatever you cannot privatize, you communitize. And you go to the community. Right? So basically you have two parts of society, either the private market or the community, pretty much running the society. There is, of course, very little scope for the state. I think that's a very good way of thinking about where we are and where we need to go moving forward and taking the promise of the reforms further. I think we want to show you a brief video, I think, right? For some of the stories of people. All of us probably have stories. I think those who are old enough to have read before 91 have our own stories. They will show you a few stories, and then I'm going to request Sri Jaga Ramesh to sort of launch the portal, and then I'll hand over the discussion and the panel deliberations to Praveen Chakravarti. He will introduce also the speakers and the panelists as part of that process.
It's not very 91 because what started in 91 was a wrong process. So I think a sudden economy gave way to an economy which things became easily available. I became a member of Parliament in 1988, and one of the perks that members of Parliament enjoyed where I could recommend somebody to get a LPG connection. India got its independence in 1947, but it only got its political independence. In 91, going to 1991, it got or began to get its economic independence. And we are still fighting for it, and we are fighting for the reforms. The first thing that comes to mind is the Burke House. So any phone call emergency will come to Burke House, and somebody will come from there and call us and say there's a phone call. And of course, we can break that down, those phone calls are expensive. So one call to call me, saying that they call you again, and about 20 minutes later, a second call will come, or we can talk. This is a story about a famous India couple. They were living in Bombay, they met each other as journalists in Bombay, got to know each other, and suddenly they decided to get married. The reason for the marriage was that one of them had the gas connection, and the other one had a telephone connection. The finance minister, Manmohan Singh, in 1991 made a historic budget speech in Parliament where he said, paraphrasing Victor Hugo, the good power on earth can stop an idea whose time has come. And that idea was that of the mobilization of the Indian economy. And when the restrictions were lifted, and the license permit quota arrived, didn't disappear overnight.
This is how we will launch it. Oh, so you can slide.
You can see on the screen.
On the screen.
There you can see.
Before I hand over the panel discussion to Praveen, let me just thank FICCI, Dr. Vidar Singh, who's here. FICCI actually has been a great partner of CCS. I know some of you were there earlier when we launched the last book here. And also we had a lecture co-hosted with FICCI of David Friedman. An interesting topic. David Friedman is the son of Milton Friedman. And the topic of the talk was society without the state. And that's a very interesting discussion we had actually in this room only that we met for David Friedman's talk. So FICCI has been a great partner and we are very grateful for having the chance to do this program together. The person who worked on the project India Before 91 is Neeraj. Please join me in thanking him also. Many CCS team members were part of that process.
Thank you, Pat. Good morning. I am delighted to be here today to reminisce about the 1991 reforms. And I think we're going to do it with some of the most appropriate people in the country that can speak with eloquent authority on what transpired, on the what, how, and why of the 1991 reforms process. So we saw a few stories. I must confess, I'm an absolute child of the liberalization regime. I was a freshly minted computer science engineer looking for a job, and the American giant IBM decided to re-enter India in 1992 because of the 1991 liberalization. I was one of the first set of 10 employees to have been offered a job there. So thank you, Deram. I want to actually start with a quote. For the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to draw very heavily from Jairam's magnificent book called To the Brink and Back, which provides an insider's chronicle of the 3-month period between June and August of 1991 and what transpired and what led the government to unshackle the Indian economy from the reins of government control. So, I'm going to begin with a quote from the book. Within the first 100 days, we will roll back prices of salt, cycles, cotton saris, dhotis of 40 counts or below, electric bulbs, among other things. This was a line in the manifesto of the Congress Party for the 1991 Lok Sabha elections. Let's think about that for a minute. The party actually pledges to control prices of cotton saris and dhotis of 40 counts or below. 3 months later, we've had the Indian economy completely unshackled from price control. So, Jairam, I really want to start with you and ask you, first, what was the Congress Party thinking when it wrote that manifesto? And why this dramatic reversal and departure from that pledge within such a short period?
Well, that 40 count dhoti is a giveaway of who wrote that. Only one finance minister who ever wore a dhoti. Mr. Chidambaram. So it was actually Mr. Chidambaram who contributed that. Incidentally, that was the first and last time any political party, around the Congress, made a firm and unequivocal commitment on reducing prices in absolute levels. I think that was the first time. And that's certainly the first and last time the Congress Party ever said a 100-day program. Because, as I mentioned in the book, Mr. Pranab Mukherjee said the government is elected for 5 years, it's not elected for 100 days. So why are you coming up with a 100-day program? But although this commitment was made in the manifesto, Praveen, remember that Dr. Manmohan Singh, on the 25th of June 1991, gave a press conference. And in that press conference, he basically disowned this promise. And he said, this can't be done. And that was the first sort of speed breaker that the new government had to face, because that created a lot of political flack for the new finance minister. And the Prime Minister himself was very upset that the finance minister had said publicly that a political commitment cannot be fulfilled, and that had its own consequences. So as to the reason why there was a shift, I think the magnitude of the economic crisis that India was going through was certainly known. It's not as if it was an unknown. People knew what was happening. But I think for the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister to actually sit in a chair and be confronted with what the reality of the day was is a completely different phenomenon. And on the 21st of June 1991, when the Prime Minister took oath and Dr. Manmohan Singh, not yet being made Finance Minister, but he knew that he was going to be Finance Minister. $900 million of foreign exchange reserves, export stagnant, economic, industrial growth on a downward slide, international confidence at an all-time low, capital flight taking place on an average of about $200 million a month, I think these are extraordinary circumstances, and I think inflation, point-to-point inflation at that time was almost 60%. So I think the reality really hits you, and I think it hits anybody. As many prime ministers have become prime ministers have realized, it's one thing making promises in the election campaign, but it's another when you come to power, when you're confronted with realities, you end up eating the words that you utter in the parliament election campaign. Mr. Narasimha was not the first and the last, and certainly you're going to get many more other people.
Dr. Milman, I want to bring you in the context of IMF. The whole specter of the balance of payments crisis and the IMF loomed large over this whole reforms process. And certainly it was positioned as a battle between India succumbing to Western institutions, such as the IMF in reforming our economy, versus protecting our economic independence. And as someone who later on went to be the executive director at the IMF and certainly had a very active role to play in the IMF, what is your recollection of events, and would you agree with this narrative?
So the way to look at these episodes and the way the IMF gets involved is in two parts. One, as Mr. Ramesh has just outlined, is the immediate macroeconomic crisis, which is the balance of payments crisis, right? There's, you have a deficit, there is no capital to finance it. I mean, part of the stories is my friend who later became governor, how he had to travel all across the world begging for money. And therefore, for that there is a standard IMF template. It's called expenditure compression and switching, because to get the macro into balance, what you have is you got an excess demand for foreign goods. You don't have the money to pay for them, so you can't hold the exchange rate constant. So you have to let the exchange rate depreciate and compress your fiscal. That's a standard template of the macro adjustment. It is applied all across the world. The only issue is of detail. I'll come back to that, how that, my impression, that was before I actually joined the finance industry. But the second part, where I was involved from more or less the start, is what they call the structural reform, what we call policy reform. And that we have been doing a lot of thinking in a different context. I will go into the context. Basically a growth context. You know, comparing ourselves, slow growth with the faster growing economies of Southeast Asia, etc. We have done a lot of thought on that in various things. I have personally, I know of other people who have. So, as far as this second part is concerned, I strongly disagree with people who say it was somehow imposed on the IMF. The way it always works is you draw your own list of things you want to do, and they judge before giving the money, as they have the right to do, whether this kind of thing will be adequate to get a sustainable level of the balance of payments. On the first part, and here I have to, it's based on information, basically the chief economic advisor, who was a leftist at that time, who was there in Chandrasekhar's time and continued to about, I don't remember exactly, but till July or August, when he resigned and left. He's the one who dealt with the numbers on exchange rate adjustment, how much was needed, and what kind of fiscal adjustment was needed at that particular point in time. And that clearly, the IMF must have had, I would guess from the standard procedure, a strong role in determining or calculating, because I don't think we had the capability in the finance industry for doing those kind of macro things. At that point.
It's interesting you say that you don't subscribe to the view that IMF kind of played played its role with a high iron fist, because Jairam actually
on the policy reforms.
Well, I'll tell you why. Jairam actually writes in his book saying in a letter that the Prime Minister has drafted or the Finance Minister has drafted to the President of the IMF, he actually takes pains to correct the spelling of labor to have a U, not L-A-B-O-R, but L-A-B-O-U-R. Program to P-R-O-G-R-A-M-M-E. And that only goes to show the extent of fear in India as to whether people will think that you're actually being completely controlled by the IMF, so much so that even your letters are Americanized. So in some sense, if that was the kind of fear, are you saying the fear was unfounded in some sense?
So two things on that. One, if you used Microsoft or Excel or Word process,
I don't know if there was
the normal thing which you get, especially if they are imported computers or used to be at that time all imported, it's American spelling unless you change it to English. In fact, very few of us used to at that time change it to English. Is my recollection, others may have some other recollection. So it would automatically give the American spelling. And therefore, yes, there was this huge fear because I don't remember for 5 years after this, any, I can count, 1, 2 economists who actually supported any specific policy reform action that we did. So there was clearly a fear. Secondly, my impression, where I don't have direct information, where perhaps Jairam Ramesh would have about cabinet level discussion, but my impression is partly it was used subtly as a threat that we will be sunk unless we get this loan, so you better agree to X, Y, Z reform. This is the impression I have. So it was kind of a tool also, and it was also a fear. But in these unusual times, if you want to achieve something, you have to use all kinds of politics.
Jairam, in hindsight, were the fears somewhat exaggerated with the benefit of hindsight?
No, there were fears, there's no doubt about it. And these fears cut across political parties. I mean, there was fears amongst the left parties, there were certainly fears in the BJP, there were fears in the National Front, and there were fears within the Congress Party. So there were certainly fears that the conditions that the IMF, so-called quote-unquote conditions that the IMF would impose on public expenditure would be something that would be politically not acceptable. So there was certainly a fear. There was, from March of 1991, actually from February of 1991, it was very clear that whichever the government that came to power would have to go to the IMF. And there was a certain inevitability about going to the IMF. So, although people criticized, people were worried, but almost all political parties and all political leaders that attended these all-party meetings were more or less reconciled to the fact that the IMF was just unavoidable. There were some, I remember, and I quoted this in the book, there were some people at that time who were advocating a default option, largely from the left. There was a statement of 35 economists that came, 35 of the leading left-oriented economists, which actually said that, look, there's an old saying that if you owe somebody $5,000, you should be worried. If you owe somebody $5 billion, you should be worried. So, since we should just, if everybody else is defaulted, why should we be so? So that there was a default option that was convincingly rejected. There was a gold option. I mentioned it. There was a big debate in Parliament on gold, using the gold option. Mr. Vajpayee himself made a big speech in Parliament on the gold option. That was considered and rejected. There was the NRI option. Many people who were saying that why don't you have the NRI? In fact, the biggest proponent of this was Mr. Chandra who was willing to mobilize all the NRIs inside, including the Sultan of Brunei, to give a few billion dollars to get itself out of the situation. But this NRI option was an unrealistic option because here was a time the NRI were actually taking money out. So, and here was a minority government. It's unlikely to instill any confidence in the NRIs. So, in a way, people recognize that if you rule out default, if you rule out gold, you rule out NRIs, the only other option is to go to international financial institutions. which ultimately the government did. So, any government, the negotiations, as Arvind says, on with the IMF had actually started in December of 1990. And Mr. Yashwant Sinha, who was then the finance minister, had actually met with the IMF in December 1990. In January, February 1991, there were discussions of the then governor of the Reserve Bank, the then chief economic advisor, with the IMF. So there were a lot of discussions that had already taken place. And on the 21st of May 1991, a very unusual statement was issued on the assassination of Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, which very rarely, as far as I know, very rarely do the presidents of the World Bank and the IMF issue a joint statement. And that night, they issued a joint statement, which was basically reaffirming their support for any government that came to power for financial assistance. So there was an inevitability about going to the IMF. There was fear about going to the IMF, but everybody knew that without going to the IMF, we are not going to get out of the situation. So it was, as Arvind says, also an instrument for doing many of the things that you would not have otherwise done. So I think it's much more.
For all the fear that is that you've laid out in the book, I found it ironic that the first statement of the new industrial policy, the unshackling price controls, came on July 4th, which is the American Independence Day, 1991. So we're inside FICCI, and FICCI has a role to play in the whole reforms process. And the role is, and this is again drawn from Jairam's book, the president of FICCI issues a statement 2 days after that voices their dissent and displeasure at the reforms policy and lays out apprehensions over a red carpet to welcome foreign companies, and coins, and then there's a famous Bombay club that coins a term for level playing field, arguing for a level playing field between domestic businesses, Indian businesses, and foreign businesses. So, I don't mean to put you on the spot here, but
by the way, I must say something on this. After the book came out, Mr. S.K. Birla wrote to me a long letter. Who was then a president of FICCI, saying that he had not said this, and basically pleading selective amnesia. But the real thing was, I think, FICCI's position, not just FICCI, industry's position was domestic liberalization first, external liberalization later. I mean, that's, to be fair to them, that was their position.
No, but as Ramesh is correctly pointing out, FICCI or organizations like this take a position on the basis of what they perceive as a response to an emerging situation. Let us not forget, because you're talking of pre-91, let us not forget the other Bombay Declaration, which is a time of independence when we began to move towards so-called socialist Mahalanobis model. The same industry bodies at that time, industrialists at that time, also supported that. I mean, completely contrary to what a market economy and private sector is all about. So in many ways, I guess that sometimes you take calls which are not directly so concerned with how you perceive the future. You look at more of how it will impact your past.
Sure. So are you saying it was knee-jerk? Was it just knee-jerk in some sense?
First of all, I think as Mr. S.K. Birla himself has clarified to Ramesh ji, who are the actual people who made that statement? That's also something I doubt, and there are others who are involved in it and took a different position. So that issue still continues, but I think in terms of how FICCI has evolved over the years, I mean, we have also evolved with time, and I think in the sense of being a private sector body representing a market economy has been the basis of functioning in this manner. Yes, they were very naturalist way back in 1927 when it got established. There was a different role at that time, and that role evolves, and as I mentioned, it evolves past independence in a particular manner, past 91 in a particular manner, and even now in a particular manner.
And Arvind, do you have a collection of businesses trying to, their reactions to this, and were there any intense efforts to stall or thwart any of these?
Yeah, the stalling part, I personally, well, twofold. One, of course, the high-level stalling would occur at the cabinet level, which don't have information. I'll be very frank. I have a lot of information, in finance ministry, secretary, government level. But I can tell you that a lot of people suffer from Indonesia. And I remember for at least 3 years, and it was only 4-5 years later that people started speaking to support us. But every single thing we did from 91 for at least 3 to 5 years there was not one person standing up. Standing up, right, means making a statement in public or even in private saying this is a good thing you're doing. All the expressions were of the dangers, of how the risk was, or was total opposition. So that included actually the business. That's the interesting thing is because they were also scared. I want to give you one example of this, which is a very interesting story, which I just remember. So maybe you can record it. Before, because I was very involved in the tax reform, the customs duty reform, and everything to do with import, export, etc. I still remember one businessman, and we were very open. I used to welcome anybody and everybody's views, and a lot of people used to come because this one gentleman, and I still remember the product. It was like a minor product, like your count of cotton, etc. I would name it. Every year, for 5 years, this chap used to come to me before the budget and say, "Mira, hum mar jayenge, don't reduce the duty on our product." Every year he used to come for 5 years, and then 10 years later, I read in the newspaper that particular product X, he was still merely producing.
Actually, the industry's approach to reforms in 91, they welcomed the industrial policy liberalization. They were apprehensive about trade liberalization.
Yeah, the external domestic thing.
They were apprehensive. I remember in a conference hall, I think not in this conference hall, but in a larger conference hall, Anand Mahendra. I mentioned that episode in my book. Anand Mahendra, very young and more dapper looking Anand Mahendra, saying that we want external liberalization later and internal liberalization first. I remember telling Anand, you're sounding like a JNU student, and there was a fear that the pace with which we were reducing import duties would affect Indian industry. It's a national fear. There was also a fear, particularly from the older generation. There was also a generational issue. There was also fear amongst the older generation that too much of moving of foreign capital would not be in our interest. And on the 31st of August, the Prime Minister met FICCI separately, CII separately, ASSOCHAM separately. They had 3 separate meetings. And in all the 3 meetings, they said, we support you, we want you to go ahead, but please be careful on trade liberalization, and please be careful on allowing majority foreign equities to allow free flow of technology. But when it comes to foreign equity, do not be sure. Those were different times. Today, it may sound very odd, but I think.
Let me just correct and modify my statement that clearly the industry whose price control was lifted welcomed it. Those whose production controls were lifted welcomed it. Those whose specific industries where investment control was listed welcomed it. So my statement was more general or average. Obviously those who are benefiting will stand up and say yes, but there weren't too many general who said we welcome this whole process, wherever it may lead. They were scared. I agree. There was a genuine reason.
And the only reason I brought that up, wasn't me to dig it into it. It was to, today when we talk about where are the big bang reforms and the political economy for big bang reforms, it just goes to show how nobody was happy in this process. The political parties were not happy, business lobby was not happy, nobody was happy, but still, somebody still had to get it done. And we have to ask the question, has that political economy climate changed when we clamor for big bang reforms today? Has that political economy climate changed? And again, I want to draw one note from Jairam's book. In a draft note that the 3 people from the PMO write as part of the reforms policy, there's one section on privatization, and the number one item in that note is Air India. There are 11 companies, PSUs that are listed in that note. This is, we're talking June 1991. 11 PSUs listed, of which I counted, 8 are still in government control today, 25 years later. So when we talk about two questions you get, in hindsight, are you really happy with what we achieved vis-a-vis the vision that was laid out in 1991? And two, why is that political economy climate not changed even today, 25 years later, for a privatization of Air India still?
I think privatization was one element of the 91 reforms that didn't see the light of day. The exit policy was another section on that note that you quoted from, which got dropped from the industrial policy. We are in many ways coming back to that exit policy as part of the bankruptcy program 25 years later. What is being attempted now in the bankruptcy bill that is before Parliament is essentially what was thought of 25 years ago. But privatization still remains a very contentious issue politically, as it was in 91. In terms of whether I'm happy with what happened in 91, I think the new trade policy that got announced certainly fulfilled its objectives very admirably. And India became clear in the international trading system, not as much as we hoped, but certainly much more aggressive than has ever been the case. I think on the new industrial policy, there's been no going back. There's been no re-imposition of licensing controls or production controls or price control. So on the new industrial policy, forward movement, as it was in the case of the trade policy. It's only in the case of the fiscal management, fiscal policy, that one can have a lot of questions, that the type of reorientation of public expenditure that was implicit in the reforms process did not take place to the extent desired, and we still have a larger than desirable share of public expenditure going into subsidies and bringing out to the sick public sector companies. So that, I think, on that maybe our record is not much to write home about, but that's not surprising because in my view, fiscal management is all about politics. Whereas trade and industry is a little more technocratic. Fiscal management really is all about political positions, political alliances, and facing the political heat by taking away an expenditure or pattern of public expenditure that is benefiting one section of society.
So you don't see the political economic climate change anytime soon for, say, privatization?
I don't see big bang privatization on the Indian agenda. I really don't see privatization of banks, for example, on the agenda. I don't see privatization of Air India, maybe privatization of India. Although I haven't heard in the last 18 months any talk of privatization of Air India. But I don't see privatization in the Margaret Thatcher sense of the term. Denationalization.
Sure.
I don't see that very much on the agenda. I see the state governments doing this. By the way, the first privatizer in India was N.T. Ramanan. The first company that got privatized in India was Hyderabad Allwyn. And there were a series of small state sector public enterprises that got privatized. But when we talk of privatization, we are talking of large public sector companies. I mean, will SAIL get privatized? Never. Will BHEL get privatized? Not in my lifetime.
LIC.
Will the railways get privatized? Never. In fact, there was talk of railway privatization, and quickly the minister had to backtrack and say, no, I'm not talking about privatization. LIC privatization, never. So financial sector privatization, I don't see. Denationalization, I don't see. Disinvestment, certainly. Opening up the sector to private players, more private players, as has happened in the case of the banks recently, certainly. But not denationalization, which means reducing the government stake below 51%. I don't see that happening at all.
I want to. Yeah, sure. I was going to come to. Go ahead, please.
No, you see, it's very important in this particular example to be clear about this here. I think there are 2 points. One is this impression that somehow the quota permit license cards disappeared in 91 or 2 or 3 or something is absolutely wrong. In my view, this is my personal view, many others may not agree. Because this thing is so down, I call it a jungle. Okay? So, this impression was created because there was some very visible at the central level, which Mr. Jairam has mentioned, the production control, the price, etc. So the last thing can tell you more about. So I have always argued that we have to keep drilling at this, because people thought, oh, it's all over and it's finished. That's not how reform gets done. Please believe me. The second part, which is, and I can give you examples of that. The second part of it is that we knew that there was much stronger opposition. At that first flush, when the crisis is there, the things went through smoothly in a sense. Narasimha Rao and Jairam know how they argued with the political authorities. In some sense, that first flush happened in one go. Okay? But everything after that was an equal or greater battle, and we have to strategize. And I'll give you 2 or 3 examples, like the monopoly in the sector. We knew they cannot be nationalized. So you look for alternative ways of doing it. One, by allowing private entry and things like that. So that is how we did it. But the big structure still remains. Okay, the things which were opposed, that was not demolished. And that is why it's very important to remember, as I said, that there were few. The way I presented it was, every leftist imposed, including some of my good friends, and you also know those people very well, would oppose everything before it happened, but would accept it after it took place. Okay? So that still remains. You have to create an environment. If you really want these reforms, there's a lot of work to be done. You have to keep at it. You think it will suddenly happen because some political person will decide, no, it won't happen. Okay? There are lots of people who still oppose those things which they always oppose. Okay? Including, as I said, some good friends of mine who are leftists. Right? They would oppose this. Okay? Even though they may have said we supported reforms from whatever, 91. After the fact,
on that somber note of we need a crisis for another round of big bang reforms, as a representative of a leading industry body, I know there is a lot of clamor for reforms, and I would want to hear your thoughts on what.
Yeah, I was going to add two little things to this whole thing. One is that I entirely agree with Arvindji and Ramesh that first of all, there are certain, well, let's call them holy cows that can't and don't actually happen. And the second, that reform is a continuous process. It cannot be said that it's all over. And I'll say only 2 things here. One, that let us never forget that any reform or any political, or let us say, well, actually, we should call it as policy reform, doesn't happen in a vacuum. There is a context in which it happens. We are a developing country and we are a democracy. We must never forget that. So this whole business of inclusive growth cannot be forgotten. It has to be within that. And we are celebrating today possibly, as you say, 25 years of reform, and we're also looking at pre-reform period. Let me ask a very basic question. Everybody says first generation reforms means addressing factors of production, land, labor, capital. Have we reformed land? Have we reformed labor? Have we reformed capital? 25 years down the road, we have done lots of things. But if you look at the basis of what a market economy stands for, have we addressed the 3 most basic aspects of it? You can add many other things to it. Today it's become environment is very important. We have to be part of climate change. Technology is an important issue. IPR is an issue. Trade is an issue. All these are issues. But if you look at the factors of production, have we reformed the 3 factors of production? And that's why, as an industry body, we keep saying that, please address this, please address this, please address this. And the point that Arvindji is making, that it has to be a continuous process of reform, and sell it in a manner that we get actually all stakeholders on board, because you cannot do this just as a top-down kind of way. And in many ways, the reform process we started in 91 did take 5-10 years to sell, but it did become part of the Indian economy, and we did do extremely well post that. So in a sense, this selling of the idea and bringing consensus and bringing stakeholders on board is a continuous process and has to carry on.
Sure. I want to open it up for questions. If you can raise your hand and I can call on you. Let's start. Yeah, go ahead. And please introduce yourself and say who you are addressing the question to.
Sure. The questions for Mr. Ramesh, and I'm Nivedita Mukherjee, Joint Director in the International Division. So who do you think was the real architect of the reforms, Narasimha Rao or Manmohan Singh? And secondly, sir, today you were pointing in terms of reforms, the very crucial land reforms. I wanted to know what kept the UP away from bringing about the land reforms.
Well, 91 reforms was a jewel book, and the technocratic aspects of the reform was certainly Dr. Manmohan Singh. The political aspect, which at that time was perhaps more important than the technocratic aspect, was Mr. Narasimha Rao. Now, as Arvind has mentioned to you, the technocratic design was not an overnight design. Designs had existed for the last at least 10 to 12 years. People had been writing about the need for reforms. People had been talking about how to reform the trading system, how to reform the licensing system. So the architecture of what went into reforms was not a black box. People knew. But it required the crisis of 91 in many ways to force the government of the day into action. But let's be very clear, the 91 reforms was less in my view, less a technocratic exercise and more a political exercise. And had that political sagacity and political Machiavellianism, virtually, not been in evidence, we wouldn't have had reforms. Because basically what got done was known. What is to be done was known. But we never got it done because of the circumstances were not right. And you needed that crisis, you needed the IMF, the ghost of the IMF, to be able to sell the reforms domestically. So to that extent, I think Mr. Rao deserves a huge amount of credit for the type of political leadership that he provided for the economic reform process. He may not have contributed the nuts and bolts of the economic reform process. Whether it was devaluation, whether it was gold, whether it was delicensing, or whatever it was. But without his political leadership, these reforms would not have been solved.
Can I just add?
Sure.
So the way I look at it, there are 4 levels of reform. Again, my purpose has always been to analyze what has happened, to get lessons for the future, right? So that's the perspective from which I give it, because so there are actually 4 levels. One is the political, where I've argued for the last 25 years that people have not given, now they are beginning to give Narasimha Rao enough credit, because he was clearly had to make the political decision. There's no question in my mind, absolutely. Manmohan Singh could not have done anything unless Prime Minister said, yes, go ahead, I will take the risk. Okay, so that political risk has to be the Prime Minister. There is no other way. Okay, so if you don't have a Prime Minister who can't take political risk, nothing good will happen. Second level is the cabinet level, where the Finance Minister is critical in our system, right through our history. So in that sense, MMS was critical because you have to convince people, you have to say X, Y, there are many voices, there are fears, you have to meet those fears. That is the job of the Finance Minister, okay? The third level is the bureaucratic. And here again, people may have forgotten, but one of the important persons was the Principal Secretary to the Prime Minister, because he had been an industry secretary. So he was involved in some of the domestic reforms. Anyway, it'll come back to me. And the Finance Secretary. So Manmohan Singh, the Economic Affairs Secretary, Monte Singh at that time. And the fourth level is technical, where it is not to get credit for myself, but I can tell you, I was forced to go on 50 committees. People don't realize how difficult it is. Not that one decision is taken, PM says, okay, this is done, it's done. I have to go and fight every week on X different reforms in different committees where people will not accept. You're talking about these cotton things. Some of these things took years of fighting to convince them you have to give this up now. Okay, eliminate all these distinctions of these 20,000 counts of X and Y. I'm just using that as an example because it came up. But there were many, many things like that. So there are all these 4 levels. So, in hindsight, it always looks very easy. And therefore, you make this mistake of thinking, oh, why isn't it being done? Why don't we just privatize Air India? Air India, I have opposed 3 different capitalizations of Air India, always losing. Every time the same result. Okay? Same result, that money is spent, it goes waste. They still keep doing it.
Mr. Ramesh, I have the second part of my question, sir.
Sure. Will, can we come back to you?
Yeah, sure.
Go ahead.
MC Verma, I was at Nuclear for a long time, and I was very much present during the 91 crisis. Nuclear is a think tank, and its chairman was K.B. Lal, who was the author of the Red Book, the infamous Red Book. Nuclear had taken a clear position that all these reforms are not only a must, they must be gone through as fast as possible. And there were lots of meetings and conferences where India put up its position in favor of liberalization and so on. So it will not be correct that there was no backing for reforms from the economic think tanks. India was the first.
Okay.
I think the foremost in this respect.
Okay. Point taken. Yes, go ahead. I'll take 3 questions and then I'll leave.
Yes, please go ahead. I'm beginning with my question is to you, sir. My question is like, why is India not being able to, Indian model has been that much successful as compared to China, where its reserves are high, where its manufacturing is also quite robust, and it has been able to do well. While in India, still the PSUs are in fact at its peak, debts in banks, power sector, telecom are still too high, and why is there so much of a rise in inequality and all? And plus that, India still have to worry about global factors, for example, US slowdown, deflation from China and all, So it has opened itself to much more vulnerable,
Sure. So your question is about the model, the India-China model. Yes, go ahead.
I'll come back to the question that lady asked, something similar. So 91 reform largely happened, as I understand, due to compulsion and not conviction. I wish to understand, was there anyone in senior government level who had this conviction? Specifically, I would wish to know in the context of then Finance Minister Mr. Manmohan Singh. Did he play only a technocratic role, or there was some kind of conviction? And when we talk about that, there you require context and the crisis for reform. Then what will be the big so-called suitable crisis to go for the next big bang reform?
Okay. I saw a hand there. Yes, go ahead.
Hello, I'm Vinder Singh. One thing is very critical that we should be protecting our intellectual property. Sir, in the reforms, we have not done anything in this. We are the poorest country in terms of intellectual property. We are not protecting our intellectual property. Secondly, the question is, in the case of GST, sir, there is a news today in the newspaper that 2,000 crore rupees worth of pan plant from Noida was shipped to Gujarat, and there was tax evasion of more than 400 crores. So how do you going to implement GST, when there is such kind of massive, you can say, tax evasion? And tax collection is only 10% of our GDP.
Okay. Very quickly, Jaya, if you could answer the compulsion.
91, Well, I write very clearly that Dr. Manmohan Singh came to reforms out of conviction, whereas Mr. Narasimha Rao came to it out of compulsion. And it was a compulsion conviction mix. And after about 2 to 3 years, when the first results started becoming evident in the turnaround of the Indian economy, then of course there is a lot of retrospective coherence given, and everybody then becomes success is many fathers. If the reforms had bombed, then you can imagine nobody would have come forward and taken credit. But the fact that the reforms did succeed after a period of time, 3 to 4 years, led even those people like Mr. Rao, who came to it out of compulsion, to say that we were always convinced that this is the route to go. But let me tell you, it was not clear that that was the route to go, because, as I said, there was a lot of political opposition, both internally within the Congress party. In fact, in a meeting of 300 members of parliament of the Congress party, when the budget of the July 24th budget was being discussed, out of 300 members of parliament, only 2 members of parliament spoke up in favor of Dr. Manmohan Singh, and about 58 members who spoke against the budget and spoke against the industrial policy package. There were only two members of parliament who spoke in his favor. So it was not clear even at that stage that, there were people who were question marks about, are we doing the right thing? Should we be doing this? So, but there were people, I think Dr. Manmohan Singh was convinced. He had been convinced before he became finance minister. He didn't need convincing once he became finance minister. In fact, his job as finance minister was do the convincing. I give 2 episodes in my book. The industry minister at that time was the prime minister himself, but the minister of state for industry was Professor T.J. Kurian, who is now the vice chairman of the Rajya Sabha, and he just wouldn't allow Rakesh Mohan and Suresh Mathur to take forward the cabinet note. He would just sit on it because he didn't believe in it. And Dr. Manmohan Singh had to call him and have a long chat with him. And finally, it was Dr. Manmohan Singh's persuasive powers that got that cabinet note out of Mr. Kurian's school. MRTP, another dreaded 4-letter word, MRTP. The minister would not let go. The minister was Vijay Bhaskar Reddy, and he had a junior minister, Kumar Mangalam, and Kumar Mangalam and Mr. Vijay Bhaskar Reddy would just not agree that MRTP needed to be reformed completely, lock, stock and barrel. So Dr. Manmohan Singh called Mr. Kumar Mangalam and gave him a long lecture on what his father would have done. Rangarajan Kumar Mangalam's father was Mohan Kumar Mangalam. And Mohan Kumar Mangalam was this great man, who brought about nationalization of the coal industry at that point of time. So Dr. Manmohan Singh gave him a long pep talk for about 30 minutes and saying, look, your father, great man, leftist, communist, but pragmatist, he would have done what he would be doing now. And finally, at the end of half an hour, Mr. Kumar Mangalam said, taking my father's name, I have to go with That's how MRTP got abolished. Otherwise, MRTP would never have got abolished. So, policy making, the lesson that you should draw is policy making is not just about formal channels, it's not just about rationality. There's a lot of other things that influence the way you take decisions. And I think in that period, the manner in which Dr. Manmohan Singh was managed to convince the skeptics and the manner in which Mr. Narasimha Rao was able to ride political opposition was truly remarkable. And that has lessons even for today, by the way. It's not just 91 oriented, it has lessons even for today.
We'll take questions around 91 reforms. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm an IT guy, been in it for about 5 decades, and I've come back to work for 21st century villages. So you're probably saying, what is that called about 1991? That's what I want to do. See, 70% of our people are still in the villages. We talk about smart cities and all that lovely stuff. The point is, you make a smart city and you blink, it'll be flooded with more people because the villages are at their extent. So if you don't solve the village problem, you can't solve the city's problem, you can't solve India's problem. Now that's the negative side. The positive side is, I think India is in a unique position. We were the youngest nation. We got enough sunshine, we got enough all those fun things. And we are a democracy.
So the question you want to ask around
I think we are today faced with a similar challenge which was there in 1991. That's when we want to fly out the board and all this stuff. We are right now in a place where we have educated people, we got Internet of Things possible, we got every third, fourth child has got a cell phone.
Okay. So is the 1991, we need a recurrence of 1991, so will that happen? Hopefully China and the global economic crisis will provide that.
No, I just want to make an observation that today we should be looking at taking off. There we are looking at sort of saving our backside.
Sure.
We should be looking at taking off and becoming number one.
Okay. Please go.
I wanted to find out from Rameshji's, respected Rameshji, that at the current.
It's what
Closer to your mouth. Currently, what's your views regarding the current situation of economic reforms, pace of economic reforms for India in its current economic and demographic scenario? So apart from 91, are you satisfied with the economic pace of India's?
Okay, any more questions around 91? 91? Yes, go ahead.
From my background, and my question is to I just wanted to know, I'm actually curious that the word socialist in our constitution, did it created a kind of hurdle? Did you face any problem during opening the doors for foreign players during 91 reforms?
No, but I know. Nobody referred to the word socialist in the constitution. Although I must, since you use the word socialist, let me just make a passing comment on what my libertarian friend, Sahaj Shah, just mentioned, that Dr. Ambedkar fought for the non-inclusion of the word socialist. It's true. There was a debate in the Constituent Assembly. K.T. Shah was a big proponent of the use of the word socialist. But from this, to draw the conclusion, which Parth is trying to draw, that Dr. Ambedkar was a libertarian and a market-friendly is completely wrong. Completely wrong. Because Dr. Ambedkar, if anything, was a great believer in state-owned enterprises, nationalization. In fact, Dr. Ambedkar went one step further. He wanted to nationalize land. And his problem with the Congress Party was that the Congress Party was not left enough, was not strongly left of center. So Parth, while you rewrite history, so much to suit your point of view. But a lot of questions have come on reforms and so on. I think that the one key message I take away from 91, the one overwhelming message that I take away is the politics of reforms. I think that's at the very core, is fundamental to what gets done, how it gets done. And I think there is simply no substitute for political management. And by political management, I mean political communication, political alliance building, constituency building, political reach out. I mean, these, if you look at what happened in 91, essentially, this is how Mr. Rao and Dr. Manmohan Singh really navigated. As Arvind has repeatedly mentioned, there was no critical mass of people who were supporting these reforms. In fact, the dominant discourse was anti-reforms. And since he has mentioned this, let me also say this, that Dr. Manmohan Singh, the finance secretary, was against reforms. He had a chief economic advisor who was against reforms.
Both of whom were removed. Both of whom were removed at one point.
At December. Not till December they were there. The foreign secretary was against reforms. So, the whole environment was against, but yet these two gentlemen were able to navigate it. And I think the key lesson is that there is simply no substitute for political outreach. And how you do it is going to determine the success of economic reforms. Whether it was in 91 or 2016, it's the same lesson.
Since so many inside stories, I have a wonderful question, because I am wondering, how did Narasimha Rao find Manmohan Singh? Manmohan Singh was not in politics at all.
Read the book.
Read my book.
Yeah. I also have an answer, but I don't want to keep it. If you want me to say, I can.
Well, I don't know if it's Chetamau's rules or not here.
No, but I don't want to detract from people buying his book.
Don't mind still, right? Verify your story. Okay, so one last, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
So this is again to Mr. Jairam. Had there not been a political need, do you think it would have taken another 20 or I don't know how many years to actually bring the reforms?
Had the political,
BOP crisis.
had there been no crisis?
The political crisis.
I'm very clear. Had there been no crisis, these reforms would have taken much longer. Right. I mean, these reforms were being talked about in the late 80s also. This reform was talked about in 1990, when Mr. VP Singh was the finance prime minister and Mr. Ajit Singh was the industry minister. So, had there been no sharp deterioration in the financial and economic position of the country from essentially November 1990 to June of 1991, we may have had to wait a little longer for celebrating the 25th anniversary.
Actually, sorry, I want to make an important point which is very relevant for today. I have been one of those who said that actually reforms or a reversal of the LQP Raj started in the 80s. And why do I say that? Because I actually made a list of 8-page appendix where I listed some of the reform. But the reason is that per capita income actually jumped from pre-79 level by 3 times in the 80s. And there's a paper on my website if you want to read it. And I credit Rajiv for that because there is no other way for it to have happened. So, but that was very small. The big bang would not have happened. You know, it really was a big bang in 91. Right. The big bang, you have to be very clear, won't happen unless there are unusual circumstances. But there is a lot you can do, and that's what requires patience and determination. It doesn't happen in a minute. Some things happen. So, by its very nature, it's opportunistic. You have to have a list in your mind. You can't say there's only one thing X that must be done, then you can keep waiting forever. You have to have a list of things you think will help the economy. And you've got to keep at it, okay? And that's very important. I'm sorry.
Right. No. In fact, I'm surprised no one's asked this more interesting question, which is counterfactual. Had it not been for the tragic assassination of Rajiv Gandhi, and he had come in as Prime Minister, would this have still happened? I know it's in the book, that's why I wanted you to.
Well, my own view is that the course had been set by January or February of 1990, 91, sorry. In fact, in one of the annexes to the book, there is a paper that Mr. Pranab Mukherjee wrote for the Congress Working Committee on February 19, 1991. It essentially is what got done in June. So maybe the style would have been different. You know, maybe it would have been. I think it would have been the opposition to reforms may not have been blunted as easily as it got blunted because of Mr. Nasir Rao and Dr. Manmohan Singh. Because, you know, economic, there's something about reforms also depends on who is selling the reforms. And these were two unlikely candidates, actually, because they were pillars of the ancien regime, they were pillars of the ancient establishment. Dr. Manmohan Singh, he was pragmatic. He didn't have a reputation of being, to use Barth's language, market friendly. Mr. Narasimha Rao certainly did not have a reputation of being market friendly. So if both of these gentlemen are advocating a certain course of action, the opposition would not be as great as it might have been.
It would have been tougher,
maybe it would have been tougher. Maybe.
Okay, with that, I'm afraid we will have to bring this fascinating discussion to a close. So thank you all. Thank you, Jairam. Thank you, Arjun. Thank you, Vijay. And there will be a formal vote of thanks by the committee.
No, I don't think we need a formal vote of thanks. It's a fabulous discussion. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. And Center for Civil Society, we love working with you, and we continue to do more of this stuff in the future. Thank you.
Don't get too influenced by them.
You need some influence.
I should be told that.
So, quickly, we open for
Under the website.
Group picture. Group picture.
And we invite everybody for lunch.